We've reached the final letter of our mnemonic aid, DEP-SOC LA. Remember, we had describe, evaluate, prescribe, starting position, orientation planes, center of gravity, line of gravity, and now we are finally to axis of rotation. When we think about body movement, a critical concept is the axis of rotation. Each movement takes place within a specific plane around an axis that's perpendicular to that plane. These axes of rotation are the invisible lines that allow us to describe body segments as they rotate in a consistent manner. There are three primary axes of rotation: the vertical axis, the anterior-posterior axis, and the bilateral axis. Each axis aligns with a different plane: transverse, the frontal, or the sagittal. This describes how the body segment rotates within each plane. In this case, the upper torso or rib cage is rotating around a vertical axis. That vertical axis will always be perpendicular to the transverse plane. Let's apply this concept to a tennis serve, where the torso undergoes rotational movement in different planes. Each of these rotations occurs around a specific axis, making the serve a great example to analyze. First, there's the twist of the torso, which happens in the transverse plane. This rotation occurs around the vertical axis, which is perpendicular to the ground. When viewed from above, you can clearly see how the torso rotates around this vertical axis. Now let's consider lateral rotation, or side tilting of the torso in the frontal plane. Here the rotation occurs around the anterior-posterior axis, which runs front to back perpendicular to the frontal plane. Observing this motion from the baseline lets us see the tilt around the axis. Finally, when the player arches their back, the movement occurs in the sagittal plane around the bilateral axis. This axis runs horizontally from side to side, perpendicularly to the sagittal plane. Watching from behind the player shows how the torso rotates around this axis during the arch. Each plane has a corresponding axis of rotation. The transverse plane rotates around the vertical axis, the frontal plane rotates around the anterior-posterior axis, and the sagittal plane rotates around the bilateral axis. As a point of clarification, let me state that each one of these planes is called a cardinal plane. That means it intersects and goes through your center of gravity. But each plane has infinite number of planes traveling out in each direction as long as it is parallel to the cardinal plane. It is still called a frontal plane or sagittal plane or a transverse plane, but it is not a cardinal plane. That is the distinction between a plane and a plane that intersects or goes through the center of gravity. And the same thing is true for the axis of rotation. There's infinite axis of rotation, and as long as they're perpendicular to the plane to which they correspond, they can be named anterior-posterior axis, bilateral axis, or vertical axis. Understanding the axis of rotation in each plane allows us to break down the complex movement like a serve into simpler elements. This insight is crucial in analyzing, observing, and planning where to position yourself to observe the player's movement and optimizing athletic performance. If you're enjoying Motion Monday, please like and subscribe.